called Jesus Worth Investigating. And tonight's talk is entitled Jesus, More Than a Fairy Tale. Why can we trust the Bible despite the critics? And so this week we've had a number of different events going on, starting this lunchtime, and they're going to be going on throughout the week. And this is just part of it. Can we really trust the Bible? And if we can, then surely the person Jesus is worth investigating. So I'm going to invite Mark up, who's our speaker. And I'm just going to ask a couple of questions. But the way the format of this evening is going to work is we're going to have a short talk, followed by maybe 2 or 3 minutes to discuss in groups, and then a question time. So literally, if you think of your questions throughout the talk, if you've got a question, text in this number, or you can put your hand up at the end. And then literally any question, fire it, Mark, and he will see what we can do with it. So Mark, what do you do?
I'm a vicar of a church in West London, in the what sounds very smart part of London called Kensington. So we are a spit away from Kensington Palace. We're also kind of spitting distance from Imperial College, if you know it, 5 minutes walk away.
Okay, and what did you have you ever been a student yourself?
Yeah. Yes, I've been a student. I studied history for my first degree, and then did law, and then did theology.
And so have you always been a vicar? Did you go straight into being a vicar after studying?
Yeah, that's right. They kind of pick you out of the school rather like MI6 or MI5. They kind of see who looks the holiest and who can kind of wear a dog collar and drink tea with their ladies, and they take you to one side. No, I was a corporate lawyer for quite a few years, and in the City of London, and they obviously decided that my corporate law training was going to give me the sufficient pastoral skills for being a vicar in the Church of England in the 21st century. So I made the switch from one to the other. Even though I'm the sort of person, I'm an oddball because I loved law, would have happily stayed doing it. Yeah, really loved it.
So you're a guy kind of used to studying evidence?
Yep, used to weighing up evidence. Yep, nice segue into tonight's talk.
But do you enjoy doing stuff like tonight? Is this kind of what you're passionate about?
No, I think this is a kind of geeky talk, really, in some ways. I probably shouldn't say that. See, you asked me to do it, so I think you probably asked me to do it, actually. But I'd much rather be, where's your audience gospel? I'd much rather be opening this with you and getting you to look at some of it and looking at who Jesus is and what he came to do and working through it together. But every time I do talks like that, I get somebody who sticks their hands up and says, why should I trust this? What evidence is there that this is trustworthy? And so it's a kind of stumbling block, a first step for some people. Can I trust that this is historical and reliable so that they'll give this a hearing? And so I'd much rather be doing talks like I'm doing tomorrow lunchtime, when we're thinking about Jesus is worth much more than the most devout religion. I'd much rather be doing talks like we're doing on Thursday evening, as we're thinking, what does Jesus say about suffering? How can you make sense of suffering? Or why is it that the call to follow Jesus is the best invitation you'll ever receive, that we're looking at on Friday night? I'd much rather be doing those kind of things than tonight, but tonight is a stumbling block for some people, so we're going to try and think about it together.
Great, cool. And Mark, one last question. Tell us what team you support and why.
I support Chelsea Football Club because I've supported them before Roman Abramovich came and bought them. That's always quite important to say. I think some people kind of think that you're a kind of Chelsea fan. I've supported them for years. I lived in Clapham. I got the ruler out. I'm a bit retentive, and I thought Chelsea is nearer than Fulham and it's nearer than Crystal Palace or Millwall, and boy am I glad I picked Chelsea rather than Millwall or Crystal Palace. I'm quite glad with where I happened to be living in Clapham at the time, and it's been a great few years.
Great, cool. So I know to Mark, have a talk, and then be thinking of questions that you have. If you've got any questions, do text into that or be jotting them down so you can ask them.
Great. This is the kind of talk that's crying out for a handout. I thought that this afternoon as I was writing it, and apologies, but my guess is you're Bristol students, so you're very bright, you can probably retain all of it, and the bits you can't retain you can probably scribble down if you've got a pen or a shirt cuff or something like that. I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak this evening. I'm even more grateful for you giving up the time to think about this evening's big question. Whenever I speak on this question, I'm reminded of the Da Vinci Code. Hands up if you've read it. Dan Brown's kind of bestseller. It's one of those kind of airplane kind of reads, isn't it? You buy it in Smith's in the airport, you read it on the plane, you chuck it in the bin at the other end. It's kind of it's a very, very gripping read. It's slightly formulaic. It's It's not going to win any Pulitzer Prizes, but I enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed it too. The main character is Robert. He's the guy I think Tom Hanks plays in the movie. And there's one point where he's talking to Sophie about people's worldviews and religions. And he says this. He says, Sophie, every faith in the world is based on fabrications. That's the definition of faith. Acceptance of that which we imagine to be true, that which we cannot prove. It's a very common perception about all worldviews, I think, and it's particularly a common perception about Christianity. That it's a matter of persuading ourselves against our better judgment that something is true, despite the lack of evidence. You've heard the line, haven't you? Do I have to stop thinking to believe? Let me say that to you. Or is it all just a leap in the dark, Mark? I've been asked that lots of times. Now, I doubt I can persuade you of the truth and of the claims of Christianity in one evening. I'll give it my best shot, but I doubt I could do that, and that's why they've got this week of events. And as I said, this is just one bit in the jigsaw, really. My aim for this evening isn't that. My aim for this evening is to give you enough ammunition and that will persuade you to take this away and read it. Okay? And knowing that it's a historically reliable document. Okay? That's a much more kind of measured goal for this evening. Because I'm confident if you read Luke's Gospel on your own or with a mate, you'd find very, very good evidence in here for who Jesus was and very good evidence for what Jesus did. And it would tell you that the claim right at the heart of Christianity isn't about going to church, isn't about what we do and don't do. The claim right at the heart of Christianity is a simple one. The claim right at the heart of it is this, that when Jesus was born and walked around and said stuff and did stuff, Jesus of Nazareth, it was none other than God on earth. And that's the claim that Reading Uncover will introduce you to. And so just by saying that, you know it can change your life forever. I hope that's enough motivation to read it. I'm going to give you some good historical evidence, I hope. So that's the aim tonight. The aim is to show that the New Testament is reliable by any historical standards, by any legal standards. And I need to address that objection because the common perception, the one that I grew up with, is that the Bible is unreliable and unhistorical. Richard Dawkins, he always says stuff much more bluntly than everybody else, doesn't he? I think he spent a life writing books on biology and evolution, and there'd always be a little kind of epilogue at the end where he'd basically say, all Christians are stupid. And then he decided to write The God Delusion, where he could take a whole book to say much the same thing. All Christians are stupid. And this is what he says about the Bible. He says, the fact that something is written down is persuasive to people not used to asking questions like, who wrote it and when? How did they know what to write? Did they in their time really mean what we in our time understand them to be saying? Were they unbiased observers, or did they have an agenda that coloured their writing? And if you've read The God Delusion, I read it like a lawyer, I'm afraid. All that training, I read it with a pencil in one hand and making notes in the margins. Notes like, not very scientific. Notes like, logic gap that I could drive a bus through. Things like that. It's a sad book in lots of ways, because lots of his other books I really like. It's a sad book because here you just think, you just got carried away, Richard. You haven't had it reined in. You haven't done a scientific job of assessing Christianity in the best possible light, speaking to the most reasonable people. You've gone to every wacko and crackpot, and therefore you're not weighing it in the best possible terms. So I was disappointed with it. I was disappointed most of all with a chapter on the Bible, because it's only 5 pages, and he tries to write it off with questions like those ones. Did you get the implication behind what he said? Unless we're gullible, unless we think it must be true because it's written down, then we'll have no business taking the Bible seriously. And what's so striking to me as a historian, and what's so striking to me as a lawyer, is just how obvious his questions are. They're questions Christians have been asking for centuries. They're questions non-Christian opponents of Christianity have been asking for centuries. And here are the 4 key questions. Okay, we're going to work through these together. Here's the first one. Do we have what they actually wrote? Question 2, were they in a position to know the truth? And then, of course, we want to know, is it true? But that's not a historical question. So we've got to ask questions about internal evidence and external evidence. So question 3, are there good reasons to trust the Gospels, to trust Luke's Gospel? And then the last question, can we corroborate what they say from other stuff? That's an external evidence question, isn't it? And it's worth noting that they are very normal and very ordinary, obvious historical questions to ask of any historical book, any ancient book. Richard Dawkins thinks that merely by asking the questions, the New Testament will go away. The Gospel will disappear. But we're going to ask those questions this evening and see what answers we come up with. So here's the first one. Question 1, do we have what they actually wrote? This is the Chinese whispers question. This is the telephone game question. Has what they wrote back then been distorted over the centuries by the whispering and the muttering, so that what we have in our hands in 2013 is not what Luke actually wrote? Okay, got the question? That's the question, the first question. And the first thing we need to say is we're dealing with ancient documents, okay? So we're not going to, there's no possibility of going and finding a signed first edition. Okay, I love second-hand bookshops. I'm always on the prowl for first editions, okay? But I'm never going to find a signed first edition of Luke, or Matthew, or Mark, or John. Okay, that's the same with every other ancient book. There's nothing unique about the New Testament, about the Gospels, with that. It's to do with the fragility of paper, isn't it? The fragility of papyrus, should I say. Okay, so the question we want to ask is, how does the New Testament compare with other ancient books? So if you did Latin GCSE, you might have had to read Tacitus. Okay, anybody did Latin GCSE? Okay, just... well, few, don't be bashful. Yes, it's okay. And if you had to read Tacitus, his Annals of Imperial Reign, and none of those manuscripts are earlier than the Middle Ages. You see, given the fragility of papyrus, ancient books don't tend to last. They're in a library, the library burns down, the library floods, somebody eats it. There are all sorts of reasons why they just don't survive over the years. And so with Tacitus, we've got a gap of more than 1,000 years from when it was written to the earliest surviving manuscript, and we've only got one manuscript. And can I say, it's worth saying, you'll know this if you did Latin, it's worth saying that that's not a disaster for Tacitus. Okay, the Latin boffins don't kick it off the syllabus. Okay, they know that that's just normal with ancient books. Okay, we know that there were more copies, but they were lost or burned or destroyed or eaten. Okay, but when we compare them to the New Testament, we kind of expect to find the same kind of thing. The same kind of number of manuscripts, the same kind of long gap. And here's the big surprise. The picture is very, very different. So when we look at the New Testament, we get thousands of manuscripts. We get thousands of fragments from all over the ancient world. And I'm not going to pretend to you this evening that there's any magic in that. Okay, it's not that it's a spooky book and God managed to kind of keep all the original, there was a fire that this was made out of asbestos or anything like that, okay? There's a simple reason that there were so many surviving manuscripts. It was the most popular book of its day. And so it was copied and it was recopied. And when it was put in the library, it was put in the posh bit of the library. So when the library caught fire, the head librarian ran and got the Bible first. Okay, bye-bye Tacitus and Caesar's Gallic Wars and all those other ones that were burning nicely in the corner. So we've got no surviving manuscripts of those, okay, or Homer's Iliad and stuff like that. What they kept was the Bible, because they thought that was the most important one, okay? And that means we've got more than 5,000 complete or partial fragments of the New Testament to use. And that means this, when there are disagreements between the manuscripts, and there are, it means that we can put them all out on the table, all these tables over here, we can put them all out and we can compare them. And we can try and work out what the original was meant to say. Okay, so we might compare ones from different parts of the world, and we might see that all the Alexandrian ones, okay, added an extra little bit. And we don't find that in any of the ones from the rest of the world, and so we think, I know what's happened. There's a Muppet in Alexandria, and he's made a mistake in copying it down. Okay, so we discount that. It's a very conservative science, ensuring that the manuscripts are preserved accurately. Okay? So those variations between the surviving manuscripts can be resolved in the vast majority of cases to discover what the original actually said. You can do that process, the process that you do with any ancient book. You can do it with the Gospels and still be very confident in what we read in our hand today. Okay? And a good version of the Bible, if you've got a Christian friend who's with you tonight and they've invited you, a good version of the Bible that they hopefully will have footnotes in the bottom of it. And it'll say things like, other manuscripts say. And none of them are deal breakers. None of them are showstoppers, okay? So Luke 11, the Lord's Prayer. Does Jesus say, pray then like this, our Father, like in Matthew 6? Or does Jesus say, pray then like this, Father? Not a lot hangs on that. Okay, that's the kind of level of the manuscript variations that we're talking about. It makes little difference at the end of the day. So the next time you're in London, why not give yourself a treat? You might think it's a treat, but why not take yourself along to the British Library? And you can see Codex Sinaiticus. Okay, dates from 350 AD, already much, much earlier than Tacitus. And it's the whole of the Old Testament and the whole of the New Testament. We can go even earlier than that, though. Because if you've got a ferry going to take you to Dublin and you missed the rugby because you couldn't get a ticket and you want to get out of the pouring rain, which it always does in Dublin, okay, you might go into the Chester Beatty Library. And there you can find the Chester Beatty Papyri, which is most of the New Testament. And that dates from 250 AD. And if you went to Manchester, I'm not sure anybody would ever want to go to Manchester as a Chelsea fan, but if you ever went to Manchester and you went to the John Rylands Library, there's a fragment of John's Gospel from 125 AD. And everybody reckons that John was written about 80 to 90 AD. And so you're talking about within 40 years from when it was written. But we don't just have manuscripts, we've got tons of them. Once you get the ones that are written in lots of other languages, you're talking about 24,000 fragments or parts of manuscripts. Okay, and here's the amazing thing. If you play the Chinese whist, translate them all into the same language, and you discover they're all saying the same thing. Okay? And that's that. It's not that to tell us it's true. Okay, I'm not going to try and urge you that. It doesn't persuade me it's true. It persuades me I've got reliable manuscript documents. Okay? Well, we don't just have the manuscripts, because people began to quote the Gospels, because they were the Gospels that they were using, and they were reading, and they were writing about, and they were quoting them. So Clement of Alexandria, he quotes the Gospel in 96 AD. Polycarp quoted it in 120 AD. Okay? And we can check their quotes against what we have here. And we can then see that they're the same. We can see that distortions haven't crept in over the centuries. Do you see, the Gospels didn't just sit in a safe for 200 years until somebody found the room, the fireproof room, that all of these manuscripts were in and decided to read them. So already, okay, that's question one, already I hope we're seeing the New Testament looks pretty good compared to other ancient documents. We can have confidence in them. But of course that doesn't tell us it's true. Okay, I'm not trying to persuade you of that. Okay? So here's the second question. Could the writers have known the truth? Not did they write the truth, I'm not going to try and pull a fast one. Could they have known the truth? Did they have access to the truth? I don't know about you, I grew up with the idea that the Gospels were written hundreds of years after the events, hundreds of miles away from Galilee and Jerusalem, by some mad monks, probably with beards, who just had one night when they drank too much mead, and they thought, this is a good idea, let's try and write the Gospels. Okay, that's what I just picked it up. I don't know if you did that. I think it was very much a 19th century kind of idea, and so I just picked it up. I didn't live in the 19th century, but that's, I'll stop. Okay, I just picked up the idea that the Gospel writers couldn't possibly have known the truth. It's just a fairy tale. So here's good old Richard Dawkins again, in the God Delusion. He says this, he says, the Gospels have the status of legends, as factually dubious as the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Now, if you're sitting here thinking that the stories of Merlin and the Knights of the Round Table are true, bad news for you is there's no historical evidence for them, okay? I don't want to kind of break your heart this evening, but if you've been watching Merlin on BBC Three and kind of assuming it's all true, it's not, okay? And so can you see what he's doing? He's saying they're nice stories, but they're not worth investigating. They're not worth taking seriously. But let me give you a timeline. Let me give you a timeline from Jesus' life and when these New Testament documents were written, okay? And I'm not going to try and pull the wool over your eyes, okay? I'm a vicar, you can trust me, okay? I'm not going to try and give you some redneck Christian Southern Baptist crazy dates, okay? I'm going to give you scholarly consensus conservative dates. I think most of these dates could be a little earlier myself, okay? But I'm going to give you the scholarly consensus dates, okay? So Jesus' public ministry, that's 28 to 33 AD, okay? And that's going on there, okay? Mark's Gospel, okay, conservative estimate, 65 AD. Okay, definitely before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Too significant not to have mentioned it. Okay, Matthew and Luke, somewhere between 65 and 90 AD. Okay, the largest gap is John's Gospel. Okay, that's not written until 80 to 100 AD. Okay, and if we take the biggest possible gap, 33 AD, 100 AD, we're talking about from mathematics 67 years, something like that. Okay, so wind the clock back 67 years and we're at the end of World War II. Okay, so we're in the region of people who deny the Holocaust. Okay? Someone could say it. David Irving says it, doesn't he? The historian. Someone could make a case for it. But the events are recent enough for us to speak to people who were there. We could go to Buchenwald. We could go to Belsen. We could go to Auschwitz. We could see the physical evidence. Okay? The resurrection of Jesus operates in that kind of short time frame. And if we go not to one of the latest documents, but one of the earliest, which is Paul's letters, which everybody reckons are dated somewhere between 48 and 60 AD, and just do those maths with me, okay, you're talking about, and Paul's letters will give us the biographical information on the life, death and resurrection of Jesus, you're talking about somewhere around 15 years after his death. 15 years ago from today is, what, 97, 98? Okay, well, when Blair first became Prime Minister, that great Dee Ream song, Things Can Only Get Worse. Yeah? And you know, are you sure he got elected? Are you sure he won the election? 15 years, a long time, isn't it? Are you sure Jesus rose from the dead? 15 years? It's not very long, is it? It's not very long at all. The Gospel writers were in a position to know the truth. I'm not saying they wrote the truth. I'm just saying they were in a position to know the truth. And here's the funny thing. Even if all we had was Paul's letters, 15 years away from the events, if all we had was Paul's letters, what would they tell us? They would tell us some of Jesus' teaching, especially how you to deal with your enemies. They would tell us that Jesus was called the Lord. They'd tell us about his death, his burial, his resurrection, who saw him after his resurrection. We'd know about his last meal and what he said. We'd know about his descent from David, the great king of Israel. We'd know about the status of his brothers and their names. Do you see? Not the whole gospel by any stretch of the imagination, but significant bits and pieces. And some of the most controversial stuff. You see, the New Testament, you know, if only Richard did the work, you know, he'd see that the New Testament is worth investigating. It's worth taking seriously, because the writers were in a position to know the truth. I'm not saying they told you the truth. I'm just saying they were in a position to know the truth. And here's the funny thing. The writers actually claim to be eyewitnesses themselves. Or they claim to be telling you eyewitness testimony. Do me a favour, will you pick this up and turn to page 4. There's a couple of kind of intro cover pages, very trendy, and then on page 4 you get the beginning of Luke's Gospel, okay? Themselves ought to present us with eyewitness historical information. Okay, we're going to look at the very first 4 verses of Luke's Gospel, and I hope it whets your appetite to carry on reading. Okay, it's the bit that somebody on mine has graffitied and put a kind of double line beside. Okay, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, he writes, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning. So think of one of these kind of investigative journalists. Think about one of these people who assesses everything, the beady lawyer, okay? That's Luke. Okay, I too decided to write an orderly account. He didn't just bung it down, okay? He took care over it. For you, most excellent Theophilus, that's a name if you're struggling to name a child in later life, okay? Most excellent Theophilus. Why? Why does he write it? So that you may know that it's a leap in the dark. He doesn't say that. That's the big shock, isn't it? Because I read this, the first time I read this, I thought, I think it's a leap in the dark. And then verse 4 says, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Well, I don't know, you don't knock my socks off. Because I've been brought up to believe it was all a leap in the dark. And suddenly I'm reading something that says somebody has gone to an awful lot of trouble to find the eyewitnesses, to investigate to examine the eyewitnesses, and then to write it all down carefully and orderly so that I would know the certainty of it. I know that none of this proves that Luke has done it successfully. None of it proves that Luke has done it truthfully, but he's clearly someone who could know the truth, isn't he? He's in the right time frame. He's gone to the eyewitnesses. He's investigated and examined them, and he's written down their eyewitness accounts. But you might wonder, I've read Dan Brown. I read the Times, every Easter the Times on the front page, they chuck out another one of these kind of, what about the Gospel of Thomas? What about the Gospel of Judas? What about, I think there's a kind of recurring cycle at the Times. And somebody says, no, we can't do Thomas, we did Thomas last year. Which one is it this year? It's Peter, let's get Peter. Okay, and what about these other Gospels? You might have heard about them, aren't they telling us that Mary Magdalene had Jesus' baby in 33 AD and all that sort of stuff, okay? Dan Brown's a gripping writer. Okay? I think the Da Vinci Code is the best of his books. Okay, he's a gripping writer. And the big argument he says is this, isn't he? He says Emperor Constantine, he's there at the Council of Nicaea in 325, 4th century, and he says, I know, let's choose 4 Gospels. There are tons of other Gospels, we'll bin them. I'll choose the 4 that could make me the most powerful. Okay, and let's just park the rest. And that's the big argument, isn't it? And it's worth saying, as with all good conspiracy theories, there's a grain of truth. There were other Gospels. That's as far as he gets it right. Okay? But if you went to the library and asked the librarian for those other Gospels, you can find them. They're in a handy little natty volume called the Nag Hammadi Library. Okay? I've got a copy at home. I meant to bring it and forgot it. And nobody here has it about me. Okay? So the Nag Hammadi Library, that's where they were found. Okay? I don't think fingers beef lasagna, Nag Hammadi. Okay? You're thinking a location of a place where they found all these things. Okay? And the Princeton professor, Elaine Pagels, has edited all of them for us. Okay? So you can go and read the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas. Trust me, if you think the Gospel of Thomas is a proto-feminist thing, it shows you haven't read it. Okay? It shows Dan Brown has never read it. Because if Dan Brown read it, some of the things that the Gospel of Thomas says about women, you would not get away with in the 21st century. Okay? So it shows that Dan Brown hasn't read it, but that's another point. Okay? If you want to read them, you can read them. Go to the library, get the Nag Hammadi Library, sit down and have fun, or not, reading them. Okay? Here's the interesting thing. You discover that you don't get Dan Brown's verdict. Because Professor Elaine Pagels, the Princeton professor who's edited them, she doesn't reckon they're the same date as the other Gospels. She reckons they're later Gospels, they're Gnostic Gospels. She dates them, she says the earliest they could possibly have been written is 150 AD. Now let's just add the two things up, okay? I don't know a lot about the reproductive system, okay? But if Dan Brown's telling me that Mary Magdalene had Jesus' baby in 33 AD, and is trying to say that her gospel is there, and Elaine Pagels tells me she's writing her gospel in 150 AD, so there's something impressive going on, isn't there? If somebody's having a baby in 33 AD and still able to put pen to papyrus 120 odd years later, it just doesn't wash, does it? And Elaine Pagels says because they're not written by Thomas or Peter or Mary Magdalene. She says, and she's got no actually likes them, she thinks they're nice gospels, okay? She's not a Christian, she's not writing from that vantage point. Okay, she's saying they are not written by those people, they're written by other people, and they're written much later. Okay? The 4 Gospels that you have access to today, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, are the 4 Gospels that the church took as authoritative and trustworthy and reliable as early as 90 AD, in the lifetime of eyewitnesses who could have taken issue with it. Now, before I studied law and before I studied theology, as Ben asked me earlier, my first degree was in history. And we all know that geography is advanced colouring and history is 1066 and all that. Okay? Now, I wonder if, hands up if you're a historian. Yes. Oh, I'm very bashful. It's a great subject. Okay, 4 of you. Okay, so 4 Latin, 4, and the rest of you medics or something. Okay, so and a couple of mathemos and civ eng 3. Okay, if you've done history, okay, I wonder if you know what the historical sources are for 1066 and the Battle of Hastings. Okay, here are the historical sources. William of Poitiers, he wasn't even there. Okay, he's a friend of, I can say Normans, he's a friend of William, the king, and he's in France writing up the Norman version. Okay, he's not even present. Okay. Secondly, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. They lost, and you get a bitter brief line about the battle. And then you get the Bayeux Tapestry. Anybody seen the Bayeux Tapestry? Great, nice thing. Okay, that was made decades later by a group of nuns on the other side of the channel who didn't know diddly from what was going on. Okay, and yet no historian that I know doubts 1066 and the Battle of Hastings happened, because they say that's normal for ancient history. Now let that sink in. And just realise that we can ask all of Richard Dawkins' 4 questions about these Gospels. Who were the writers? What was their level of access to the events? And we can have very, very sure ground. And we can say, compared to 1066 and the Battle of Hastings, we have got an extraordinary amount of confidence. But what we have here is what happened. Okay? Here's question 3. Do we have reasons to trust them? That's an important question, isn't it? But perhaps they had an axe to grind. Perhaps they wanted to start a movement. Perhaps they had an agenda that coloured their writing, as Dawkins says. Okay, it's an internal evidence question. From the sort of books that they are, do they look like the sort of things that you and I ought to trust? Well, what about Luke's aim that we just read in the opening verses? So that we can know the certainty of the things that we've been taught. Okay, not a leap in the dark, but he wants people to have certainty. He's not writing, he says, to give a book about moral teaching about life, backed up by some dubious miracle stories or something like that. No, he's aiming to give people an eyewitness account of what actually happened, of who Jesus was, of why Jesus came. He wasn't writing a legend, he wasn't writing a fairy tale, he wasn't writing a myth. So their aim helps us. So does their identity. Who were these guys? Some of them were very educated, some of them were less educated. They were a mixed bag. The New Testament was written by people all over the ancient world for different audiences, and yet their stories corroborate one another. A mate of mine called Alan is a barrister. I'd been talking to him for quite a long time about Jesus, and I said to him one day, look, Alan, you've never said, what do you make of it? What do you make of who Jesus was? And he said, I just don't know whether I can trust the evidence. And I said, you're such a lawyer. Okay? I said, would you do me a favour and would you read one of the Gospels? And he said to me, no, I won't read one of them. I'll read all of them. Because I'm very used to reading eyewitness statements. And I will be able to tell you exactly what is wrong with them come Monday. We've been out for lunch on Friday. We met for lunch on the Monday. And I said, I don't suppose you got around to reading the Gospels? He said, I read them all. I've got several sheets of paper at home on them. And he said, Mark, you need to know, I read eyewitness statements every day. I get paid thousands of pounds for doing it. I can smell a rat a mile away. He said, I've never been more persuaded in my life that they are eyewitness documents. I said, so we're making progress. That's quite something. Here's a guy who does it every day for his job. And he read all 4 of the Gospels side by side. And he said there was no attempt at collusion as far as he could see. He said that's always the thing that really get worries him with eyewitness statements in criminal cases, where it smells of collusion. He said there were small differences between them. Nothing that went to the major line of events. Nothing that went to the major truths. But there were enough superficial differences. As if 4 of us were downstairs and we saw a road traffic accident. And the police came along and said, right, you've got to, okay, Tom, you've got to write down your witness statement. Brian, you've got to write down your witness statement. Dalton, you've got to write down yours. And I've got to write down mine. Okay, we all hand them in. We've all seen the same event. Tom mentions that the person driving the blue metro is a Newcastle fan because he'd noticed that sort of thing, I wouldn't. Okay, Brian mentions that the person driving the red Audi was going at 45 miles an hour because he can tell a speed camera. Okay, and we'd all write slightly different things, but we're talking about the same event. And Alan said that's what he read as he read the four Gospels. So their aim reassures us, their identity reassures us, and then so does their audience, because they're writing to persuade very different groups of people. Some of them are writing to persuade hostile groups, the Roman and Jewish leaders. Some of them are writing to encourage Christians who are very positive but have got a keen interest in getting it right. And the New Testament authors wrote when all of those people were still alive. But they're writing when people are alive, and it's as if they're saying, you saw Jesus, you heard Jesus, am I making it up? What do you think? So internally there are strong reasons for seeing the New Testament Gospels as credible. But given their claims, we've got to ask the final question, and here it is. Can we corroborate the Gospels with external evidence? The first piece of corroboration might surprise you, and that's the existence of the church. The way that the church, one minute there's no Christians, the next minute there's loads of Christians, the way that the church exists and explodes onto history is a fact that makes any historian ask why. Why does it happen? So in Pompeian Herculaneum, 2 Italian towns buried by the ash from Vesuvius in 79 AD. As the archaeologists go to work, what do they discover? Buried underneath in AD 79. Okay, it's got to there from Jerusalem. Okay, just think about that. In those days, without the internet, without planes and trains and automobiles and that sort of thing, it's got from Jerusalem to Pompeii. In AD 64, when Rome burns down, and Nero calls in his kind of Alistair Campbell and his PR spin doctors, and he says, who am I going to blame this on? And they say, let's blame it on the Christians. And so he decides to blame it on the Christians. And I don't know about you, that's very striking. That tells me, from 33 to 64 AD, this movement that began with a handful of people in Jerusalem has exploded so that it is now seen as a significant threat in Rome, the capital of the known world. And if you can't do geography, okay, if you only got as far as the colouring, and you can't work out how far Jerusalem is to Rome, let me tell you it's the same distance as Jerusalem to the top of the Shetland Islands, as Rome to the top of the Shetland Islands. Okay, that's a pretty long way, isn't it, in that period of time with that poor communication. So what about Jewish testimony? Well, Josephus, he's a Jewish general who writes after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. He writes in Greek for a Roman audience. He's a confused man, I think. Okay, and because he's writing a history of Judaism, he makes lots of references to Jesus. What about Roman testimony to Jesus? Tacitus writes about the fire of Rome in AD 64. Okay, and he tells us that they're blaming the Christians, which all began in Judea. It was all led by a guy called Christ, who was executed in the time of Tiberius, while Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea. That ticks lots of the boxes, doesn't it? AD 112, Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, he's trying to stamp down on Christianity because it's spreading all the way across Turkey. Okay, and he says, help, Emperor Trajan, I need your advice because I'm trying to get these guys to shut up and they won't stop worshipping Jesus as God. Now, lots of people argue that over the centuries, Christianity didn't begin with people worshipping Jesus as God. It just kind of grew and grew and grew over the centuries. And Pliny in 112 AD writes and says, they're calling Jesus God. They meet for worship on the same day of the week, every week, and they worship Christ as God. It just gives us encouragement, doesn't it? That there are other people without any particular axe to grind writing about this. Archaeology. I'm conscious there are archaeologists in the room, so I'll be careful. Okay, 100 years ago, the consensus was that the Gospels were written very, very late by people who weren't there, by people who clearly didn't know what they were talking about, and had never really been to Jerusalem. One example that the archaeologists gave 100 years ago, John chapter 5. John chapter 5, Jesus talks about the pool of Bethesda. And And John writes and tells us how many porticos there are and all that sort of stuff. And because the archaeologists hadn't discovered it in Jerusalem, they said, see, John obviously doesn't know what he's talking about. And that argument held sway until 1888, when some chap, probably a Brit with a silly hat and a feather, put a shovel in the ground in Jerusalem and discovered the Pool of Bethesda. Just like it's written up in John 5. And the more that sort of thing happens, the more we have to say the people who wrote these books were there. They knew the world. They knew Jerusalem very well. Because remember this, that in AD 70, Rome destroyed Jerusalem. It was crushed to rubble. The community who were there was scattered to the four winds. Okay? So you can only write if you were there before AD 70 and you knew it. Okay, I've saved the best bit of information until last. Okay? This is as geeky as I get. Okay? And I don't do geeky, but this is as geeky as I get. Okay? The personal names in the Gospels. Okay? Some Jewish researcher, I pray that he got a PhD for it because it must have been the most dull research anybody's ever done. Okay, he goes around the world and he looks at every tombstone, every bone box, every ossuary, every inscription, and he writes down every Jewish name ever given in Palestinian Judaism and diaspora, the scattering Judaism. Okay? And he writes it all up into huge amount. What was the frequency of the names? You know, the kind of thing we get every year in the paper, top 100 names. Is it Jack or Harry? Is it Amelia or, you know, Scarlett or Hara, whatever it is. Those kind of things. He was doing all of that for Jewish names in Palestinian and diaspora Judaism. Okay? It must have been very dull, but it's very significant. Do you want to know why? Because we discovered this, that the most popular name in the Jewish world is the most popular name you find in the Bible. The 9 most popular male names in the known Jewish world at the time, and they didn't have access to computers, okay? This information has only just been worked out, okay? The 9 most popular names you find in the world at the time were held by 41% of Jewish males. In the New Testament, the 9 most popular names are held by 40% of the men mentioned in the New Testament. Okay? Statos tell me that's very significant. Okay? If you're a stato, you'll know how significant it is. Okay? Let me tell you why it's so significant. Because if I'm writing 400 years, 500 years later, from another part of the world, and I'm trying to invent Christianity, and I'm trying to scratch my head and think, I wonder what the names were. I wonder what kind of agriculture they had then. I wonder what kind of things were going on there. It's very hard to pull it off without Google, isn't it? Without Wikipedia. It's very hard to pull off if you live the other side of the world and you can then reinvent it. To get that level of historicity, that level of statistical analysis, it is mind-blowing. If you don't believe me, go and buy a book the size of your house by Richard Bowken called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Okay, if you've ever struggled with insomnia, you will never struggle again. Okay, it is not the easiest book to read. Okay, he's a professor of New Testament up at St Andrews, and he is making loads of people with this book. He's piggybacked on the Jewish research, and he's making loads of New Testament writers take very seriously the claim we're discussing tonight, that this is eyewitness historical evidence. He says not only does the New Testament get it bang on statistically, with things like plant names, personal names, agriculture names, all those kind of things. He says, here's the mind-blowing bit. They get it bang on in a way that it can only be Palestinian Judaism and not diaspora Judaism. That's impressive to pull off, isn't it? If you're making it up, okay. And in contrast, he says there's later Gospels that the Times keep wheeling out every year. Thomas, Peter, Mary. They get it spectacularly wrong. So what have we seen? Let me ask you a simple question. What other explanation is there for all of the evidence? We have what they wrote. They were either eyewitnesses or they were recorders of eyewitness testimony. We have good reason to think that they're truthful. And where we can check what they write, it's accurate. So Luke's Gospel deserves to be taken seriously, and it deserves to be read as history, not as fairy tale, not as myth, and not as legend. And as we read it, the conclusions we come to about Jesus can be trusted. So will we read it? You've got a chance to ask me any question now. You can ask me questions about the archaeology if that's your thing. You can ask me any questions about Christianity if you'd like to. That might be more interesting for me. I don't want to skew you on that. Ask me any question, okay? But here's a question for you before you ask me a question. What reason have you got not to read this? Given its claims, given its credibility. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot, Mark. What we're going to do now, have a think about the question that Mark just read us, what reasons we've got to not read this, but also let's be thinking of questions. Just turn into pairs or threes, have a chat about it. If you want to write them down, you can do. If you want to text them into the number on the board, you can do as well. We have probably 3 or 4 minutes and then come back and ask some questions together.
Your chance now, so fire any questions. I don't guarantee that I'll, especially if they're BD history things, I don't guarantee that I'll know all the answers, but feel free to fire any question. Who is sitting with somebody who came up with a good question? Put your hand up if you're sitting with somebody who came up with a good question. Okay, brilliant. Ask us your question.
You were saying how there are lots of manuscripts from the Bible because it was such a popular book at the time and it was copied and spread around. I was wondering how many manuscripts of other religious texts, like say the Quran.
Yeah, very good question, thank you. So there's a big difference in how we view the Bible manuscripts and how we view other manuscripts, because the question you're wanting to, as a historian, I'm only asking as a historian and as a lawyer, I want to say, to what extent are they verifiable? Okay? So let me give you an example from this. So open this to chapter 3, page 20, okay? And just notice the kind of, in passing, it's one of many passages over depicting Luke's Gospel, in passing, just notice the historical information that we're given. Okay, what are we told? In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah. You know, this is not long ago, far away kind of territory. So this is not. It doesn't sound as if it's written as a thing. Now, when you come to the Quranic text, and there it was kept in the same language, and they prized copying it very carefully. So I have no doubt that what we have today with the Quranic text are very similar to what they had originally in 600 AD. Okay? But here's the difficulty. This all happens in the full glare of history. This all happens in a way in which it can be verified. And the difference with Islam is simply this, as far as I can see. Jesus doesn't go into a cave and say, God gave me Luke's Gospel. Okay? In a way that's not verifiable. Okay? That is not a statement about truth. That's a statement about history and evidence. Okay? So Islam comes along and says, believe our scriptures because it was given to us by divine revelation, almost by dictation, in a positive way. Christianity comes along and says the manuscripts are kind of there and the events are there in the full view and there are other people commenting, Roman and Jewish writers, and you can weigh it up and you can think about it and you're rabbits and you can work out which of those you think is going to be a historically more trustworthy account. Okay? Does that help? So I've no doubt that the very careful copying method of the Islamic scholars means that we can trust what they have today compared to what they had in the past. I think there's a much more fundamental issue at stake, which is how they got it in the first place. But that's just a history thing. Robert, our resident archaeologist.
Not archaeology today. How are the claims made about Jesus in one of the Gospels any different to the claims made about someone like Apollonius of Tyana, who also asserted that he was the Christ, also claimed to have performed numerous outrageous miracles? How, and there are again, there are reasonably reliable sources for his life. How is that any different to what we've got here?
I think what you do here is you weigh them up, don't you? So you go and get the sources for Apollonius, and you get the sources for Jesus, and you sit down and you read them, and you say, what's the date gap? What's the earliest surviving manuscript? How many of the manuscripts are there? What do other people say about both of them? And you just do the historical, ancient history stuff of weighing it out. And I think there's very, I was a historian trained to be a lawyer at university, and I was very cynical, very sceptical. And if I say that morally it was very inconvenient for me to believe this, you probably get the picture. Okay? My problem was in my second year, somebody said to me, have you ever looked into the evidence for it? And I hadn't. And I found it quite a difficult question to resolve, because I thought, he was smirking because he knew I was a historian, he knew I wanted to be a lawyer, okay? And he just said, that makes you think, doesn't it? So not every historian wannabe lawyer looks at evidence, and I hadn't. It was only surpassed by a guy with a double first from Oxford 4 years ago, who when he arrived in London said to me, I think I'm the most ruthless analyst in the world. And I said, have you ever read an eyewitness account of the life of Jesus? And he said, no, I haven't. And I said, how did you get a double first from Oxford in history without ever having read an eyewitness account of the life of Jesus? You must be one of the most significant historical figures at least. And he said, are you saying I should read it? And I said, I'll do better than that. Why don't we go out for lunch and we'll read it together? We read it together. He's the most annoying person ever to read the Gospel with. It took us 2 weeks to get past 2 verses, another 2 weeks to get past Mark chapter 1 verse 8, because he was just asking questions about absolutely everything. But by the time we got to Mark chapter 1 verse 14 and 15, where Jesus says the beginning of the gospel, this is the preaching of the kingdom, repent and believe the good news because the king is here. I said to Dom, how do you think we're meant to respond to this? And he said, well, he's transparent with the king. It's like the king riding up on his charger and planting his standard between your feet. And just that kind of slightly painful process of looking at the evidence with him, weighing it up with him, going through the gospel with him, and there he was right in front of me saying, I think it's true. And so all I'm saying is, I'm not telling you it's true. I'm saying the biggest frustration for me in the world is not with the people who say I've looked at the evidence and I disagree with it. The biggest frustration for me in my job in London is that I meet person after person who's never looked at the evidence and doesn't really want to look at the evidence. And I just can't understand that, because the claims are too big. Jesus says he will deal with our past. He says he will wipe all our past mistakes clean. He says he will give us purpose and identity in the present. And he says because of his death on the cross and because of his resurrection, he will get us to heaven and not hell. Now those claims are enormous, aren't they? And that's, this takes less time to read than the Times. And it's probably a lot less time to read than the Telegraph. Okay, and the only bit of the Telegraph worth reading is the crossword at the back. Okay, and the sports pages. Okay? So all I'm saying is, why don't you give it a go? Have a look at it. By all means, compare it with Apollonius and see who you put your money on. See who you'd want to be your leader. Any other questions? Yeah.
You say you've got 5,000 fragments. What was the
Or complete copies.
Or complete copies. What was when are they from? Like when's the earliest one? When's the latest?
So the earliest fragment we've got is the John Rylands Library, the fragment of John's Gospel, John 18, I think it is. Okay, and that's there up in John Rylands Library, and that's 125 AD. Okay, now we think that that's a long way after the events. That's 40 years after it was written. It's 90 years after it all happened. It's a bit dubious, but be fair. Compare it with other ancient documents. Tacitus, over 1,000 years later, and the 4 people here who did Latin GCSE gallantly read Tacitus and thought it was the truth. Okay? I'm just saying, be fair. Homer's Iliad, a couple of 1,000 years time gap, okay? Or 1,500 years time gap, and not many manuscripts left. Caesar's Gallic Wars, why do I believe that Caesar won the Battle of Elysium? Why do I believe that? Because Caesar's Gallic Wars tells me. There are only 10 surviving manuscripts, okay, from 1,000 years after the event. but that's normal ancient history. Okay? With Jesus, you've got 5,000 complete copies or fragments, and if you bring in the Syriac ones, because you can imagine it was spreading like wildfire. People said, I want to translate it into our church's language. That's Coptic. And what about our church's language? That's Syriac. And what about Aramaic for the local dwellers in Jerusalem? And what about this language and that language and Latin and Greek for the kind of Greek-speaking world? And then you get all of these copies mushrooming so that you've got 24,000 copies. And the striking thing is this: you translate them all into a common language and then compare them. And there are no substantial differences, there are no showstoppers, and there are no deal breakers. And then you kind of sit back and you go, so there's tons of evidence from a much shorter period of time than any other ancient documents. And you're like me in my second year at university. There's a mountain of evidence in the road. And I'm trying to step around it because it's inconvenient at the time. But I'm meant to be a historian. I'm meant to want to be a lawyer. And so I think, well, I can do the three monkeys thing, kind of close my eyes, close my ears, and close my mouth, and go la 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 and pretend it's not there. Or I can be the scientist. This is the irony of Richard. I can be the scientist and go where the evidence leads. See, the tragedy about Richard Dawkins' writings, I think, is this, that he comes to it with an a priori assumption. Now, he's allowed to do that, but it's not very good science, is it? Scientists here, hand up if you're a scientist. You come to something with an a priori assumption and you don't go where the evidence leads. That's not great science, is it? I'm a historian, I don't know, but that doesn't strike me as terribly good science. And I'm saying to you tonight, if you're prepared to put your a priori assumptions to one side, given the claims, given the historical credibility, and then prepared to engage with it, well, that makes me go to sleep happy. I'm not saying you've got to sign on the dotted line. I'm not saying you've got to join the CU, perish the thought. Okay? I'm just saying, okay, why not read it for yourself? Okay, why not be a great man and look at it for yourself?
We've got a couple of questions from the phone.
Brilliant.
So someone said, while we can trust the historicity, how do we know that things like miracles seem a bit scientifically inaccurate? How can we know these things weren't misunderstood at the time or exaggerated?
Yeah, C.S. Lewis has got a great phrase for our 20th, he's probably talking about 20th century, 21st century propensity to look back on the first century and go, those gullible fools. He calls it this, he calls it chronological snobbery. It's a good phrase, isn't it, okay? Why do we think people in the first century expected people to rise from the dead? They didn't. That's why it was such a shock. Okay? That's why when people got healed of their leprosy, which was both a social stigma and a medical tragedy, okay, and an economic tragedy, because you couldn't work, you couldn't go near people, when people got healed of it, it was the talk of the town, because it didn't normally happen. Okay? Let's give them their due. They didn't expect people to get healed. They didn't expect people to be able to feed somebody with a couple of fish and some loaves of bread, some buns on a Sunday afternoon in the picnic. Okay, not 5,000 families. Okay, they didn't expect anybody to walk on water. They didn't expect anybody to die a brutal, grisly Roman execution. They were pretty good at doing what they did best. Okay, and then 3 days later to rise from the dead, physically be able to eat fish, eat a barbecue, be seen by fire. They didn't expect it. That's why the church grew. Okay? So if you come to the gospel with an a priori assumption that says miracles don't happen, therefore miracles could not have happened, that's your right. But it's not very good science. Okay? Go where the evidence leads. Ask yourself a simple question. If God was choosing to step into his world in the person of his Son, would we not expect the laws of nature to buckle? Would we not expect to see him do extraordinary godlike things, making mind-blowing godlike claims, and modelling an extraordinary, breathtaking godlike character? And when you read Luke's Gospel, you discover a godlike character, striking godlike claims, and stunning godlike power. Okay? And I want to say to you, that's what I would expect to happen if God was coming into the world. But if I put a glass ceiling up, and I say miracles can't happen, therefore they couldn't have happened, well, I'm going to be Thomas Jefferson, aren't I? I'm going to get the scissors out, and I'm going to start chopping bits out of the Bible, and I want to say, gee, it's pretty rubbish science. Anybody want to come back on that, because it's a big issue?
Well, I would just draw attention to, you know, Darren Brown? Is it Darren Brown?
The hypnotist guy, the magician,
yeah. Popular movement. Well, I find his stuff like amazing magic almost. I know that it's got rooted in sort of psychological manipulation and all this stuff, you know, and he's quite a clever guy, got a lot of charisma, and I was just going to suggest...
could it have been the same?
Yeah, could it be...
Yeah, that's a very good question. Could it have been the same? And I guess the one you'd want to go to most of all is the resurrection, because that seems like the weirdest one, doesn't it? If you can pull off conning people with a resurrection, then the other stuff is small fry, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I guess the challenge is this, that you read kind of psychologists on it, and they say hallucinations don't happen the way it's recorded in the Gospels, the way it's recorded in the New Testament letters. So you see him appearing at different times of the day, to different groups of people on their own, to small groups of people, to large groups of people. He does physical things, he says stuff, he walks through walls. That's not the kind of stuff that we would expect to see anybody doing. Okay? And all I'm saying is, most of us, I think, watch Darren Brown and think it's very clever magic. It's a very clever conjuring trick. I was at a kid's baptism lunch the other day, and they had a conjurer, and they said, there's one person in the room everybody can trust, it's the vicar, and I groaned. And I thought, what the heck? And he said, I want you to think of a card. And so I thought, okay, let's show you, randomly think of a card, okay? And he said, then he said to the father of the child, could you pick that pack of cards out of my bag? I hadn't touched it, I'm over here. He was nowhere near it. And he said, what's the card you're thinking of? And I said, the Four of Hearts. And he said, you sure it's the Four of Hearts? Sure it wasn't a 6. And I said, no, it definitely wasn't 6, it was the Four of Hearts. And he said, Harry, would you open the pack of cards? There's one turn the other way, would you show us what it is? And it was the Four of Hearts. Yeah, that was pretty impressive. How on earth he did that? But, I think it's because he had a 2 of diamonds and a 2 of hearts before, and I think it's the kind of Darren Brown thing. I think it's suggestive, I think it's that. That is totally different from somebody who appears and eats fish in front of lots of people and walks through a wall and is seen by 500 at one time. They're not all hallucinating at that point. So I think I'd weigh it up. Again, just read it, just weigh it up and see what you think. Okay. Another question from the phone?
Yeah, one more question, and then, guys, if you text questions, there's a couple more, then do go and grab Mark afterwards.
I'll answer these ones quickly.
Yeah, go for it. So, you've mentioned that Jesus made godlike claims.
Yeah.
Can you just point us to somewhere where Jesus says something like, I am God on earth, or worship me?
Yeah, John 10:30. I and the Father are one. That's a pretty good godlike claim, isn't it? When he heals the paralysed man, Mark 2:5, the most striking thing is he says, your sins are forgiven. The friends go to the roof of the house, they dig a hole in the roof of the house. If you're the owner, you're pretty cheesed off. They lower the paralysed man on a mat in front of Jesus, and everybody knows why they've done it, because he's paralysed, his legs don't work. And everybody's waiting for Jesus just to say, hang on a minute, I'll carry my sermon on in a minute, you're healed, get up. And Jesus says, son, he sees their faith and he says, son, your sins are forgiven. And everybody's jaw drops and hits the floor. It's the most politically incorrect thing he could have said, because his legs are the problem, not his sins. And Jesus says, no, the man's biggest need is to have his sins forgiven. And then the religious leaders who are there, they say, who does this guy think he is? Claiming to do something that only God can do, claiming to forgive sins. Jesus knows what they're thinking, and Jesus responds in Mark 2:10 by saying this, so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth even to forgive sins, I say to you, take up your mat and walk and go home. In front of all of them, the paralysed man gets up, picks up his mat, and walks out in front of them, and their jaws hit the floor. Okay? So he doesn't just claim godlike things. Jesus is also somebody who then backs them up with evidence. Okay? If you read Luke's Gospel, just make a note of all the godlike claims you find in Luke's Gospel, and you'll find lots of them.
Cool. Just one last question. I think there's a joke in the crowd. who's texted, why have Chelsea been so rubbish in the last 5 years?
5 years. I have an Arsenal mate who says to me, oh, Chelsea are rubbish, they're going to get rid of so many kind of managers. They've had 9 managers in 9 seasons, and my reply is always the same. Yeah, 9 managers, 9 seasons, and what have we won? Oh, everything. At Arsenal, you've had 1 manager for 8 seasons, and you've won 10. So there's obviously a logic somewhere in the Roman brain, because he likes victory.
Cool, I hope that answers your question. So, what I'd like to do now, just before we wrap up, everyone in their chair should have one of these little feedback forms. So thanks so much for coming tonight. We'd love to have your feedback about maybe what you enjoyed, what you didn't enjoy, what we can do better next time.